Behind him was the small steam engine propelling the boat. He had designed and built it at his farm. The steamer ran a generator and an electric motor. Like the old-fashioned steam engines, it gave instant power, unlike solar technology. And using thermal energy to heat steam, it was carbon-free. His lawyer had patented this breakthrough invention, and Ford Motor had scheduled its engineers to look it over. Thomas Hollyday, in his book, Enemy. Welcome to Delmarva Today. I'm your host, Harold Wilson. My guest today is Tom Hollyday, and we're talking about his latest book, Enemy. Tom is a prolific writer with 8 novels in his Sunday River romance mystery series and a number of reference books, as well as a series of humorous cartoon books of garden and woodland creatures. Of particular interest to Tom is how to provide water to backyard pets and wildlife during the cold winter months. Tom, welcome to Delmarva Today.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, we're very pleased to have you here, Tom. Tell us about your novel, Enemy, and how this novel fits in with your Sunday River romance mystery series.
Well, like most authors, I write about the region I come from. And if you go by all the current writers on the hit parade and so forth, they're all talking about an area they come from that they know reasonably well. My family's been down here 300 some years, and after a while, you get to know a few things that are happening around you. I think it's kind of a microcosm of the USA. The country is basically a small town country. I know we have our cities, but basically most of the people are from small towns, and they run their little democracies with good and bad ideas, but they're always generous and worthwhile and have a lot of common sense. The area which I write about has been in constant combat with people trying to take it over since the Ice Age. And even before that, it was hit by a meteor, which came across from Baltimore and smacked into the shore down around Salisbury, right where you're sitting now. So that's important, though, for us to know, because the Ice Age is very important to the idea of climate change. A lot of people realize that the Earth is in a trip around the sun, and it tilts. Every 100,000 years, it goes through a complete tilt. At the beginning of the tilt, you could think of it this way, as an ice age. And as it goes along, it gets warmer because the oceans let go a lot of CO2 into the air. That heats it up. Eventually, it gets to be too much. The CO2 dies out, and it goes back into a cold area and an ice age. Standard cycle: higher CO2, lower CO2. And it all happens because of the tilt. The tilt maneuvers it colder and warmer. So the Eastern Shore is a place that has all these things happening and all this kind of people.
So how does that relate to your book now, Enemy?
Well, we're in the middle of a CO2 problem, and what I wanted to write about as we deal with it was, what did the animals think? You got to keep in mind that human beings have fought back the animals, destroyed them, or taken all their power away. Now, when the CO2 comes up again and starts to get the climate warmer and starts to affect the oxygen, we have the problem of animals trying to fight back against, and particularly because this is a human-caused problem, increasing the CO2 more than it normally should by burning carbon, the animals are getting hurt. So in this book, animals come out of the ground and go after the humans.
And there's a reason for their doing this?
Well, what happens in the theory of the book is great fires create CO2. The CO2 goes down in the ground and cuts the oxygen going to these insects. There's trillions of these insects, and they come out of the ground to go after the cause of losing their oxygen.
So the insects, you say they go after the cause. How do they know what the cause is, Tom?
Well, it's basically a search for food, but common sense would say, since there are no other possible sources of this except the humans, and the humans are fighting them back, and they can see the carbon use and the fires, that's the normal enemy.
What is the genesis of your book, Tom? Where did you get the idea for this?
Well, I've worked a lot with animals versus humans over the years in all my books. All my books have animals in them. And I've always thought that in one of these major crises, what was happening to the animals? We see in these floods and so forth that people are going out to save the animals. But what about in something like CO2? Whether it's a human problem or not, CO2 will affect the animals. And since there's nobody taking their side, they can gang up on whatever they see out there that might be causing it. And that's essentially what happened in this book. The animals came forth and took on the closest thing they could find, anything that was alive and also edible. It's like the old days when lions were crossing a veldt in Africa and the humans came out towards them. The lions didn't ask questions, they just went after the humans.
No, that's well, they were threatened, so they I guess were responding to the threat. Are you offering this book, Tom, as a warning about climate change?
Well, not really. We've been affected by all kinds of crises over the centuries. As I mentioned, we've had meteors. We'll probably have more now that there are more humans around. We'll probably see more. There's all kinds of problems. There's viruses that come up, a lot of things that affect humans and, of course, animals.
Well, in the book, you outline a number of ways in which people can respond to the threat of these insects coming up out of the ground. I talked a little bit about the response of the people in the community.
Well, I put the people in this situation the same as I've seen them in my other books. People are basically very resourceful. They have to protect their families and themselves. In some cases, they'll get out the old shotguns, whatever kind of tools they have. I remember years ago when I was on the shore seeing a big snowstorm and people were out plowing with tractors. People used what they have. As far as panicking, I don't think they panic any more than any other situation. And fear, I don't think that comes up either. One of the things they do go to is religion. And in my book, I bring out the preachers. I have one preacher in there who is very close to my heart. He wears a tie which has little neon lights up and down it. He's in a lot of my books, and when he talks, the neon lights go off.
He's kind of an evangelical preacher, isn't he?
I guess you might call it that.
And what does he advise?
Well, he reads from the book, and he gives various phases, things to do, comments to make. He speaks to the crowd in the auditorium at the school where they all gather to hear from the mayor and so forth, and from the government people that come by to talk about the crisis. And he says, go to your church and pray, and then follow orders from the mayor. Probably pretty much what would happen in our little towns down there today. I do remark in the beginning of the book that the wife of the fire chief remembers what her mother told her, and she gets down on her knees to watch the big fire in the beginning in the position they were taught in school because of the risk of Russian bombs, A-bombs. I thought that was kind of typical of the panic.
Well, you and I remember that very well. The kids were supposed to get under their desks and cover their heads in the event of an atomic bomb attack back in the late 50s and early 60s.
Yeah, it was the kind of thing that people down in that area, and I suppose anywhere in the country, which is why I call it a microcosm of America, do to handle panic and horrible crisis. People don't, for the most part, run down the street screaming. They get busy and take care of themselves.
And figure out how to confront
Right.
the enemy in your book.
That's right. And most enemies in life are unexpected. In this particular case, what's fascinating about this enemy is it's different than any enemy most of us have dealt with, because most of our enemies are our size or bigger. This enemy is tiny. And so the only real power we have over this enemy is maybe chemicals, which can also get back and hurt us, or stomping with our feet, or in the case of this book, using fire, which is the very reason that the things came out of the ground. They didn't like that fire, which caused CO2. So, but you're going way back to cave days, where the main weapon we use is the one the cavemen used when a lion was outside their cave. Kind of fascinating. With all the bombs and weapons and everything we have, that none of them work on this fella, or these fellas.
You say the enemy was very small because they're represented by these insects. However, in your book, the enemy becomes very, very large because of the numbers, and also because they began to operate in concert.
Exactly. They have from earliest days, and this particular species is very old, goes back to the dinosaur days and earlier. And
Tom, let me interrupt you for just one moment. Is this species in your book, are they an extant species, or are they an insect that is a figment of your imagination?
no, they really exist. Parts of them exist. The jaws that doctors use to hold cuts together are true. They're very tight. The fact that they can eat flesh is also true, because most ants and smaller insects cannot get the food into their digestive tract. the little lines, the little tubes that hold their bodies together are too small. So they have to masticate the food into almost liquid. But these ants can handle it, get it in there. And as a result, they can take all they can eat right back into their nest. Makes them disappear after they kill something. It's very hard for anybody to find any of these bugs left after they killed something. They all go back down their hole with food. I did invent a lot of that to make sure they were more of a useful threat.
Right, and they do operate in concert.
Exactly. Over the centuries or millennia, they've made these huge tunnels that go all around the earth. And they're handy for them to go visiting each other, and also handy to get messages out. So one nest might get attacked, it spread the word all around the world to let all the other ones come up to earth and start attacking, which is what happens in the book.
Where did you find these creatures, Tom?
Mostly in my head, but I wanted something tiny, and I wanted something of the animal community. And it didn't take much work to come up with ants, because ants have been portrayed in the movies as villains, but they've always been huge. The real power of ants is tininess. They go everywhere. And so I thought it would be a fitting type of animal that would convince humans that they better stop hurting the earth, especially its other citizens. Ants are just as much a citizen as humans, which we often forget.
Well, that seemed to be, to me, to be one of the primary points of your novel. But there were a couple of other things in your novel that intrigued me. One is the use of steam power. And of course, that was to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But tell us about the steam car and the steamboat, the boat driven by steam and electricity that I read in the opening of our program.
Well, you have to understand about steam. Steam is created by heat. And in the early days of steam power, we used wood or carbon to create the heat. The most recent types of steam are the big generator plants, which use carbon fuel, or the nuclear plants, all of which use heat to create hot water steam, which drives generators. All I did was to move it one step further. In the world today, we have electric power created by sunlight, which is a very slow system. You have to have a lot of big screens to get the electric power into batteries and then convert it to something that will power a motor. In the case of sunlight, sun is basically a fission system, a big nuclear weapon device. Many people are trying to figure out how to create fusion here on the Earth, so they don't have to rely on the sun. So fusion plants are very big, very expensive, and they've only started to get some running because they run at very, very high temperatures. But there's another way to use fusion, and that is to get it from the sun. We have the electric chargers, screens, but a more efficient way is to take it like kids running a magnifying glass and burning insects, run it through a magnifying glass, heat it up, and it'll heat water. It's a very simple thermal, I call it thermal system. All the book talks about is a thermal system where this fellow has figured out a way to power his little car with a thermal system running a steam engine, then powering a generator, then powering batteries. And he takes this onto a variety of systems. The same concept is being used now by Spanish companies and other companies around the world who are building these huge thermal plants, which use the sunlight, heated, brought through mirrors to heat. Actually, they use salt. They heat the salt up to a molten level and then use the heat from that to run steam engines. But it's not the old steam engine we used to grow up with belching smoke and harvesting our fields down on the Eastern Shore. But it's steam. There's nothing matter with steam. Steam is the most efficient way to create heat to run a generator. As I say, we use it in our nuclear submarines, same system.
Well, I found the little car in your novel a very interesting, I would call it even an innovation by this character who is very, very sensitive to the amount of CO2 in the air and the desire to reduce that level. But he also had another idea, which was related to education and the education of young people. Tell us about the school. If you could call it a school, it's an educational place, but it's much more than that. Tell us about the educational theory that he was operating off of.
Well, that goes back to my old days at Johns Hopkins. I got my writing seminar education there and political education, but I also got a master's in education itself. I wasn't able to follow that after Vietnam because I had a lot of problems from the war, but and it requires a lot of patience to teach. But anyway, I recovered from that. But the theory of this is, when I was teaching, I used to notice very, very interesting young people who could take an engine apart and put it back together, a regular V8 engine. And they were only 10 years old. And the only reason they needed school was to be able to read the motor manual and follow its instructions on fixing the engine. That taught me that the reason these children needed education was to research the how to do more with motors, not how to read a book. And they usually were failing students. Hard in reading, hard in all the subjects of, in my case, 4th grade. But they could do this. So it struck me that we were way off. We follow in education the concept of Rousseau, who was a very great democratic politician and writer in the days of our founding and revolution. He said that education didn't begin till age 30. Well, that's all very fine if you come from a sophisticated aristocratic family where you can play around for 30 years. But these children we have today are out working. If they're not allowed to work before age 16, that doesn't mean they aren't thinking or working out in the barn. So I just thought we were way off in the way we do it. And putting these kids up to age 16 or 18 before they can go to work or before they can do anything useful gives them a pretty good reason to drop out. Not because they're a vandal or anything, just because they're bored. So anyway, that was why he put that in there. It was kind of 2 cents worth. In my books, I like to work with all kinds of themes because in fiction, often you have 3 or 4 stories going. But I think it's also good to have a big theme and then a little theme. Keep people interested.
What I get from reading about the creative students in your book and the methods you set up, not an institution, but the capacity of study and scientific endeavor you create in your book, makes me think that you have a feeling, and from what you have just said, that we are underusing the creative capacity of our young people today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you'll note that I don't want to give away the book, but you'll note that some of the students up on that farm, they call it the gas farm because I was working on CO2, but actually helped the town survive.
No, very clearly they play a role in the struggle against the enemy. Tom,
as Chekhov said, you can't put anything in the book. There's always got to be a reason for it.
Absolutely, we know that, don't we? The other thing about your book, though, that I want to ask you is that I got the sense that it's clearly a book expressing the need for us to pay clearly more attention to global warming and what is happening in our world in terms of our responsibility for global warming. But I wanted to ask you, and I know you wrote this book before the great pandemic, which came in January of this year, or at least caught our attention in January. But I got the feeling reading your book and the threat that this book is also somewhat of a metaphor for this pandemic that we're struggling against. It's a global pandemic, as your enemy was global. Very, very difficult to deal with, as your enemy was very difficult to deal with. And looking at it now, do you have any sense that this could also reflect the pandemic that we're up against?
Well, of course, you got to remember that the virus, the humans didn't cause it. I mean, there's some political chaff going on around who caused it, but maybe somebody dropped a bottle of it in some lab. But the point is, humans didn't cause it. The insects and the attack on this book, the CO2 problem, was caused by humans. Big difference, big difference. We've had viruses before, and we fought them and we dealt with them. And today's medicine helps us to fight it. John's going to get out there, my associate from the Vietnam days. He's going to get in there and give them what's for to get the system set up on COVID. I'm sure it'll be effective, but it's a different animal, and we caused it. Now, I hope that the people that take on CO2 will realize it really probably not a whole lot to do with anything that humans can really solve, because they're going to have to sit down and realize that it's going to happen every 100,000 years. The Earth's going to get too hot, it's going to be floods, and then it's going to be an ice age, and it'll start all over again. That's in the facts. And if it gets out of control, when the CO2 gets too bad, then we'll be turned into Mars. It's just the facts, the physics of life.
So would the idea be that we need to lower our contribution, but at the same time, as human beings, we have to learn how to adjust to these gigantic fluxes in nature?
But I think that's the kind of thing that he'll probably be pushing also. Not just stop burning carbon, but also get ready for what's going to happen in the next 10 to 50 years about how we have to live. We can't stop it, not all of it.
Well, Tom, you've written a very thought-provoking book, and I want to thank you for that, and for joining me today to discuss it. And I want to thank also all of our listeners. This is Delmarva Today. I'm your host, Harold Wilson.